Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, Episode 76, The Life of Gruffudd ap Cynan, Part 1. When we last talked about the beginnings of the Norman invasion of Wales, we talked a lot about how they slowly creeped into the south, as well as how their influence over Wales changed the nature of the country and how it regarded itself. It was during this point, in fact, that we see the people of Wales speaking of themselves as Cymry rather than British. While the King of Britain still exists, the very nature of Wales changed inexorably away from the old Roman notions of a united island people dealing with interlopers called Saxons to a new phase of the people as people of the land, as comrades in arms, comrades in life, and in point blunt fact, were no longer linking themselves to the old Roman Britain or the idea that they could remake Roman Britain once more. As well as the change in verbiage, the Welsh saw Powys rising again out from the shadows of Gwynedd. The death of Blethyn, the king of Gwynedd, had forced the kingdom to deal with internal issues rather than external ones. Their ability to push their own power had changed and had drastically reduced for a time. Treharm ap Caradog, the king of Gwynedd, had risen to power at the death of Blethyn in 1073. And because of this, his first cousins once removed, the sons of Blethyn, were forced to take over Powys, while their cousin ran Gwynedd. However, in the shadows lurked the descendants of Rhodri the Great. Those Mervians once again were ready to ascend one last time to the throne of the old stalwarts of the northwest. Gruffudd ap Cynan was one of these heirs, and the start of the final dynasty to rule Gwynedd, and really, honestly, the last dynasty that ruled over the remains of what was the Welsh kingdoms. Gruffudd was born in Dublin and was the son of one of the former rulers of Gwynedd. His maternal line, however, had links to the Dublin Vikings, and they were actually known as the Silkbeard, which is an awesome name because it probably meant somebody in that lineage had some really great hair, and definitely not pillager Vikings. Yeah, right. But nonetheless, interesting to kind of see that. His grandfather, Iago, was killed when Llywelyn rose to power, and his father, Cynan, was probably at best only briefly on the throne of Gwynedd, if at all, after the death of the last king of Britain. And before Harold's choice, Blethyn came to power. As a claimant to the throne and heir to the family of Rhodri, they had to flee to Dublin to avoid being killed or captured. Obviously, Cynan couldn't stay in Gwynedd and expect to survive. And most of the Welsh kings were well known for taking care of those that were related to previous dynasties, as has been proven in the past. And obviously, they would make no exception for this young man. He would then marry Ragnhild, who is the daughter of Olaf, which is about as Viking of a name as you're going to find. And they then started to have their family. And shortly after the birth of Gruffudd, or possibly around the time he was born, his father Cynan died. This loss meant that Gruffudd was raised predominantly in his Viking family. Now, hilariously, he is described as being a very well-mannered child. Of course, that's not the hilarious part, but rather that he was brought up delicately, which is a very strange turn of phrase, if you want to be truthful, in an era of Vikings and a son of a Viking, mostly known for their violent tendencies. But nonetheless, that's what the life tells us, so that's kind of what we have to go on. Gruffudd himself was not content to be a Viking. He was, after all, an heir to a mighty name and an ancient kingdom. He likely saw this as a way to reunite Welsh kings and Irish kings with the old ally Gwynedd. And as we know, the Irish were likely instrumental in establishing this kingdom in post-Roman times. So with that in mind, and with the help of the Irish, and likely some Viking allies, he prepared to return to his kingdom, as he saw it, while the various Welsh kingdoms dealt with the Marcher lords. His first intervention was to attack Anglesey at the death of Blethyn. Somewhere between 1073 and 1075, the Chronicle of the Princes mentions he goes to the island. And in fact, in the life, it describes him having gone and talked to the nobles of Anglesey to try and bring them on board. And I think in some ways there was thoughts that he was preparing to set up his government there. He would also talk to people of Llyn and would actually go and set up conversations with other cantons in the area of Gwynedd and closer to the border with Powys. So the reality is that he was working heavily to try and angle himself as kind of the obvious ruler. As a brief aside, we need to talk about our sources for this information. One, of course, is the Chronicle of the Princes, which I just mentioned earlier, which it was felt was written predominantly in the south, especially this copy that I have, which might explain why they feature southern kings so heavily, and specifically from Dyfed and from Deuddbarth over the northern kingdoms. Well, we do have the first real personal biography, the life of Gruffudd ap Cynan, written within possibly as early as 50 years after his death. As we've noted, these sources can be slightly skewed, including factual errors, propaganda, and in a number of them some fantastic additions that are more fiction than fact. As an example, included in this story is a legend about Merlin predicting Gruffudd's coming, and that of a prophetess who appears to him in Anglesey and predicts great things in his life and that he will eventually be king. Of course, when you take this story at face value, then it's an interesting one, and it sort of betrays some weirdness about it, which sounds more older Welsh kind of pagan feel to it rather than a Christian era feel to it. As well, it gives you, again, that sense of mythology and legend that's built up around guys like this. And definitely take all of that with a grain of salt, because almost 99.9% sure none of that probably happened. But nonetheless, it is a part of this life, which is written, it claimed to have been written in as late as the 13th century. So we still have a document that's relatively close to the time period we're talking about. It's written from a Welsh perspective with a Welsh ideal, probably written by people who were writing to the kings of the time, who of course were descendants of this man. So there is a reason for it, and there's a reason why they're pumping him up, for lack of a better word. And so we have to take that into account when we're listening to these stories and talking about this life. So while all of this is going on and Griffiths is trying to consolidate his power with several nobles across Gwynedd, and with that support, he then attacks the king, and basically he fails miserably. But the claim in the book, in the life, is he was betrayed by his nobles, and this will be something of a consistent storyline, but it's a storyline all through the Welsh history. When you listen to what goes on with the kings, a lot of it comes down to betrayal by somebody at some point, which leads to their untimely end. And it's very rare that you have kings who die in their beds because of this. And so, again, he's betrayed, defeated. As they're losing, his troops get him out of the field of battle, and he flees back to Dublin, in disgrace, I would argue, and having failed once again to take back the kingdom of his ancestors. Meanwhile, while he's trying to get the men and materials he needs to come back and take over his kingdom, Traherne, the actual king, is busy trying to put an end to the guy who killed his cousin Blethyn, and he defeats the king of Deuddbarth, Rhys ap Owen. And with the death of this Rhys, another Rhys comes to power in Deuddbarth, this one friendlier to Traherne, and his name is Rhys ap Tudor. He then ascends to the throne. You may remember him because he was mentioned in a previous episode, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. With this revenge achieved, Trehorn may have had the ability to use that victory to justify why his men should be loyal to him. Reason why is because Griffith has returned from Dublin after begging for help. And in this case, he has with him Vikings and Irish, as well as his loyal Welsh supporters, who I'm sure he has some. And they again take Anglesey. But this time he runs into a bigger issue because the Vikings are not happy with not being paid. It appears that in the version of the story from the life, he stops them from pillaging the area. This may or may not be true. We don't fundamentally know. But what we do know is that they get mad at this stage and they take him prisoner. It's an interesting idea that they would then take him prisoner, still then go on a pillaging spree to get their pay. And that's what I figure it was more likely about, is that he kind of overpromised and underdelivered when they got there. And that is a difficult thing to do when you got mercenaries. You can't afford to have your mercenaries turn on you. So typically you try not to get into those circumstances, and you try very hard to keep them happy. So it is interesting to see what happened there and how that caused them problems, and specifically gets him captured and taken back to Ireland yet again. Meanwhile, while this is going on, or shortly thereafter, the Normans then invade with the Earl of Chester and with Powys allies, although they don't explain who these people are, and possibly even one of the pretenders to the Gwynedd throne. And they go through and cause all sorts of trouble for Gwynedd, causing what's called the tribulations of Gwynedd in the life. In fact, it says one of the areas was wasted to the point where it is a desert in the phraseology of the life. Take it for granted that that's probably not completely accurate. Griffith, on the other hand, again, once more returns to Ireland, this time probably more bitter than ever, as he again was betrayed. Again, his own men betrayed him and caused this problem. So once again, he goes begging and pleading to his relatives in Ireland. And this time, instead of going north and trying to take Anglesey, they actually go to Doithbarth. Then there's a very elaborate story as to why Griffith would make an ally with Rhys ap Tudor, the king of Doithbarth. And basically the story goes on a very long descriptive terminology. And depending on who you accept as telling the truth, the life plays it off as if Rhys thought that Griffith had betrayed him, and that because of that, he then turned around and went and betrayed him back, if I was to read this properly. In effect, that he went then and turned back to his ally, or erstwhile ally, Trehorn, and fought with him in this battle. So I don't know how much you can take that as face value. If it's true, then Griffith looks really foolish a lot of times in this storyline, because again, he's betrayed by somebody, and again, it gets him into trouble. This time, however, he has the men and material to win. And somewhere between 1079 and 1081, and I would kind of lean towards the 1079 more than the 1081, Griffith attacks Trehorn, and we'll go into why that is. And his allies kill all of these kings. Both Trehorn and Rhys die here, and in the process, this destabilizes both the north and the south. And Griffith, instead of taking over and kind of consolidating his power, appears to go on a power trip and starts just wrecking stuff. Like he's getting his revenge for everything that happened, from the betrayal of Powys, in the slaughter of what happened with Gwynedd, to dealing with Doithbarth very harshly. And in the process of time, he will create an advantage point which the Normans can look at and say, hey, we'll move in now and take some of this for ourselves. So in a way, his revenge is overwrought, overly destructive, and really seemingly brought an end to the southern Welsh kingdoms, because the Normans are already there. The Marcher Lords are already moving forward. They're already pushing into Deuddbarth territory. By the end of this, they will have taken the complete southern half of Wales, and it'll only be West and North Wales that survives. And so you have this disaster that happens. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of people that aren't terribly happy with Griffiths at this point. He has made a lot of enemies, both in the English camps, probably with even amongst the Irish at this stage, who are probably furious with him over what's happened in the past and his constant appeals for more troops. And likely, one could argue that part of the reason why his revenge was so harsh is because his mercenary buddies, again, need to get paid. And how do they get paid? If your, boss, in effect, or your client hasn't got the ability to pay up on his own, well, in pillaging and taking land and territory and slaves. Of course, slavery is still hot and heavy in this era, and all the jewels and gold and, anything that isn't nailed down, basically. In fact, the life goes to the point of bringing up the fact that one of the churches is raided. It talks about total destruction of certain things, but you always have to take that for granted as probably not completely correct. It's probably more for dramatic purpose to kind of show his anger rather than actual fact. But nonetheless, this is a guy who was upset, was wanting to take his revenge on these people. And in the process of this, again, he doesn't create friends, he creates new enemies. And in this case, one of his enemies is a tremendously named person called Mirian the Red, who basically runs off and gets quite upset over all of this. And he goes to the Earl of Chester, Hugh, and tells him how to figure out who Griffiths is. And so when the Normans come through and invade again, Griffiths really hasn't even got time to take the throne and become, a king in proper sense. This must have happened fairly quickly afterwards. He gets captured, he's taken to Chester and thrown in jail. Surprisingly, he's not executed, and it appears that he's not completely locked up as we would think of a jail, but rather he may have been at one point, but then was released to sort of wander around, is what I would gather, because his escape comes in a very strange way for somebody who would have been in jail or in the stocks or something along that line. But nonetheless, he's captured and captive for 16 years. Now, that's why I say it's more likely that it was more like 1079 rather than 1081, because by the time he comes back on the scene, it's now the middle of the 1090s, and there isn't enough time comparatively for 16 years to have gone by. And we're talking 1094, so we're not even talking close to that. So I lean much more towards 1079. By 1085, William the Conqueror is dead, and of course his son, William Rufus, will now rule England. That'll be important because he will do some things in a little bit which will cause the Welsh to revolt. According to the Welsh chronicles of the princes, between 1091 and 1093, the Normans had overrun Dyfed and Ceredigion, and with the death of Rhys ap Tudor II, the king of Deuddbarth, he was killed again, this time by Cadwgan ap Bledin, who is the lord of Powys and the son of Blethin. This is the same guy who plunders Dyfed, and in the process weakens it to the point where it's super easy for the Normans to take over. They then enter the weakened kingdom, and they're unable to resist the Normans, and it fell largely into their hands. And as I said earlier, the south has completely fallen to the Norman Marcher Lords, leaving a rump version of Deuddbarth left, along with the northern powerhouses of Powys and, of course, Gwynedd. So, of course, this then creates the point that we talked about last time, which is that the daughter of Rhys, Nest, who is captured and then taken by the Norman lords after the death of her father, and becomes sort of a power play and a propaganda point for both sides in this battle between the two of them, and in fact becomes a point of contention. Meanwhile, as she's having all of that happen to her, Griffiths would eventually be carried out of Chester by some Welsh loyalists and eventually spirited back to Gwynedd. He then had arrived, all right, to his kingdom, and with a small band of loyalists and not much else. Worn, sick, and probably tired, and probably malnutritioned, it took him a while to nurse himself back into a semblance of the man he probably used to be. But now the former king was ready to advance and take advantage of what was now becoming the unrest in Wales, and he had learned his lessons that had been well taught about ruling and how to rule properly. And things are about to change for Gruffudd in a way that we're not able to initially see. And of course, this is a heroic story that's written by the victors talking about their famous ancestor. So again, we're always shown Gruffudd as being doggedly determined to take back his kingdom and being someone who was predicted to be this fabulous king and this heir to a massive dynasty of amazing importance to Britain and to Wales. And so, of course, he's going to succeed. This is obvious. This is history, and all of that kind of thing. So with all that taken into account, we're going to stop here. And we're going to pick this story up next time, and we'll continue to talk about how he does gain the kingdom and how he keeps it for the next 40 years and becomes the king that they need to set up the new dynasty. And with that, I'd like to thank you. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, you can always reach me at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at welshhistorypod, or you can come to Facebook and talk to me there at facebook.com/welshhistorypodcast. And if you want to find out all the things that we do and all the entertaining stuff we're up to, you can find everything we do at distractionsmedia.com. Until next time, everyone, thanks a lot. Thanks for listening, and take care. Bye-bye.
Edge of the Abyss Creations is a proud sponsor of the Welsh History Podcast, your one-stop shop for unique jewelry, paintings, and other crafty creations. You can find us at facebook.com/edgeoftheabyss1.
This has been a Distractions Media production. For more info, you can check out everything we do at distractionsmedia.com.
Hello, this is Gary Chahot welcoming you to check out the French History Podcast. Our main show covers the history of France from the first humans until present. If you liked Mike Duncan's The History of Rome and wanted a similar program covering the land of beauty, culture, and love, we are exactly that. We also host world-renowned scholars who have delivered guest episodes on their specialties, including 18th century pirates, revolutionary booksellers in 20th century Paris, the special friendship between the Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson, and numerous others. Learn what you love and listen to the French History Podcast today.